Thank you, Shimon. Now, one of the less talked about parts of last month's federal budget was the delay on foreign aid targets. And that got us thinking, how does Australia stack up against the rest of the world when it comes to giving? Well, it depends how you look at it. Wealthy nations agreed as part of the Millennium Targets to a target of 0.7% of national income to be devoted to foreign aid. Now, right now, Australia is giving just half of that. A number of European countries, particularly the Scandos, are well above their target, and the UK will meet its target as of next year. But here in Australia, the government only plans to hit 0.5% by 2017. So the question is, should we be giving more? And to discuss the question, we have World Vision Australia's CEO, Tim Costello in Adelaide, philosopher Peter Singer and James Paterson from the Institute of Public Affairs, who are both in Melbourne. Good morning to you all, gentlemen. Now, Tim, I'll start with you. How do you think Australia performs, just relatively speaking, as far as giving foreign aid?
Well, we need to distinguish between private giving of citizens to the World Visions and Oxfams. We're very generous and we take it seriously. But when it comes to public giving, that's our tax dollar through AusAid, we're actually right down the second half of the league table of OECD countries, 13th. And most Australians actually are quite shocked when you tell them. They think we might be giving 5% of our national income. When you say it's only 0.35%, they're shocked. There's great ignorance. They simply can't believe that we're that far behind.
We've also had emails from people, though, Tim, saying, well, listen, we give privately, so why should we give through the tax dollars as well?
Well, private giving is really important. However, it's not the largest part. So $1 billion is raised privately by all the aid agencies in Australia. That's fantastic. But AusAid is up at $4.8 billion, government monies, because that's where the serious money is. So if you're going to really save lives, turn around health and education, we've got to be doing both. It's not a choice.
And do you think the money is well directed? Is it well spent?
Yeah, on the whole it is. We've pulled back from spending money, AusAid has, on contractors and consultants, which I doubted, on just government to government, which is bilateral, where you can lose it in corruption. And AusAid rightly have said we'll focus on poor people, not just poor nations. In other words, the poor nations led by someone who might be corrupt. We're going to make sure it hits the target, and I think that's been very effective.
Okay. Now, Peter, if I can come to you, amongst your many works is one that some might have read called The Life That You Can Save. Do you argue that we basically have a moral obligation to help poorer nations than our own?
That's right, I do. And I think we should be doing a lot more. I think Tim Costello is a little soft on the Australian public in saying that we're very generous in our giving to the Oxfams and World Visions. By the figures that he just gave, we're giving less than 10 cents in every $100 we earn. Maybe we're giving about 7 cents. This is private giving I'm talking about now.
Yes.
In every $100 that we earn. That doesn't strike me as very generous when you consider that we are one of the wealthiest nations in the world. We spend money on all sorts of luxuries without thinking twice about it. And there are more than 1 billion people who are living on the purchasing power equivalent of about $1.50 per day. And as a result of that, of course, their children die at a much higher rate than our children do from diseases that don't kill here, like diarrhea or malaria or measles. So I think we do have an obligation in a world as unbalanced, as unequal as that,
Peter,
to do a lot more.
We seem to have become convinced, and I think it's got something to do with the political dialogue, that we're really doing it very tough here in Australia, even though we're amongst the wealthiest nations in the world. How did we come to believe this?
I think we judge our standard of living in a relative way. We think that, well, we were a bit better off a few years ago before the global financial crisis, and so we're doing it tough. But, you just have to walk around the streets of any Australian city. You see lots of people sitting at cafes, spending $5 or $10 on cups of coffee that they could make for themselves for a few cents at home. Obviously, they're not doing it tough, or they would be living in a much more thrifty way. So, I think we don't realise, by comparison to the rest of the world, that for most people just getting safe drinking water is already something that they have to struggle to do.
Now, James, can I bring you in for a slightly alternative point of view? There are those who say that increasing foreign aid, or indeed giving foreign aid full stop, is not the answer to improving the standard of life or of living in developing nations. What's your argument around this?
Look, I think that's basically true, Andrew. I mean, I was just thinking then, this is a very input-focused debate. We're really focused on how much money we're putting in.
Yep.
But the most important thing in poverty eradication is the outputs. Who cares what the inputs are if the outputs are successful? And I think there's a very serious question to be asked about whether foreign aid is the best path for solving poverty. Now, over the last 50 years, Western countries have given about $2.3 trillion in foreign aid, and it's been predominantly focused in Africa. Yet the average African country is no wealthier today than it was 40 years ago.
What do you put that down to, James?
The only thing that solves poverty, the only thing that eradicates poverty is economic growth. Over the same time that Africa hasn't gotten rid of poverty, countries like China and India have literally lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. In China, 660 million people in the last 30 years alone. And they've done that through economic growth. They've done that through a government that has deregulated their economy, that has privatised assets, that has opened up their economy to global trade. And that is the only way to sustainably lift people out of poverty. That's what we should be focused on, not foreign aid.
Certainly those certain targeted aids can help economic growth. I think of one example, for example, with the Hamlin Fistula Foundation, helping women who have had fistulas in childbirth and who basically can't work or take part in the economy at all unless they're fixed. So do you think that sort of targeted aid is still a necessary response?
I'm not saying there's no need for foreign aid. I really encourage and I'm supportive of private charity, and I do think that governments have a role, particularly in times of crisis, like, for example, the Indonesian tsunami, to come in and help out. But I think it's really instructive to look at, say, Africa and the countries that have done well versus those that haven't done well. The best example of this is Botswana. Botswana has a per capita GDP of $14,000 every year. And that's roughly the equivalent of Turkey. Now, Botswana is not one of the richest countries in Africa and one of the fastest growing countries in Africa because we give more foreign aid to Botswana. We give Botswana no more foreign aid than any other country in Africa. But the reason why it's wealthy is that they prioritised economic development. They set up the domestic political institutions that are necessary for growth. That's the rule of law, private property rights and free trade. And if you don't do things like that, you will not have economic growth and you will not solve poverty.
Now, Tim, what is your response to that? Because certainly a lot of aid must go to countries where there is not an advanced or indeed any democracy and no sort of free market economy.
Yeah, well, two responses. Firstly, it's amazing, despite the figures James says, how little we actually spend on aid. For the billion people who are overweight in the West, the weight loss industry spends $400 billion a year. For the billion people who are malnourished and living on $1.25 a day, many not making it, total foreign aid of all Western governments is $120 billion.
Right.
So
that's a quarter.
The second response... A quarter. The second response is it's a false contest. Is it aid or trade? It's both. Aid has to deal with health, as you pointed out. When we say, oh, look at all the money we've wasted in New Guinea, $350 million a year. Well, I'm in Adelaide. The Adelaide Hospital, New Royal Hospital, is going to take $400 million a year for the next 30 years. So we actually comparing $350 million for a whole nation in New Guinea. We've got to do both. Absolutely, free markets, rule of law, property rights, trade. Totally agree with James on that. But when you're dealing with health and education, you have to deal with that because people won't work and be productive otherwise.
Peter, we have to leave it here. But before we go, you yourself take a very personal approach to your giving. Can you just very quickly tell us, what you do in your own life?
Sure. Well, I really have more than I need to meet my basic needs, and I think I ought to be sharing that. So I'm currently giving between a quarter and a third of what I earn to organisations like Oxfam and other organisations that I judge to be effective in helping those poor who are not helped by what James is talking about, by free trade and the rule of law. There are still going to be people in extreme poverty who just can't get into the economy for various structural reasons. and who need the basics like clean water, like some basic health care, like the opportunity to educate their children. And I think those of us who can, who have something to spare, should be sharing it with those people through those effective organisations.
Well, certainly gives us a lot to think about, and I assume they're not writing million-dollar cheques for philosophers these days, so, you know, there'd be certain things that you're going without to make that happen. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning on what has been a somewhat enlightening discussion. Thanks for that. Over to you, Sammy.